Maya Ito, a soft-spoken physical therapist and former contemporary dancer, returns to her coastal hometown to help save the community dojo she grew up beside. When the dojo's charismatic but arrogant black belt, Kenji Saito, mocks her as an unfit challenger and threatens the studio's future, Maya accepts a public bout, less for victory than to prove that courage can outmaneuver cruelty. Guided by an old mentor who teaches balance over brute force, and buoyed by a friend who remembers the dancer she once was, Maya trains in silence and memory until the night of the match. The story follows her through doubt, flashbacks, and a single, decisive move that isn't about power, but about listening, a throw that uses Kenji's momentum and pride to bring him down. Cinematic, intimate, and emotionally true, the tale explores themes of embodiment, redemption, and the quiet alchemy that turns shame into strength. The town looked like a photograph sun-faded at the edges, the harbor's pilings teeth-bared against the tide, storefronts with hand-painted signs, and the whitewashed roof of the Kodama Dojo catching the afternoon light. Maya stepped off the bus with an old duffel over her shoulder and a flurry of nerve she had not felt in years, nerve that hummed like a violin G-string tuned too tight. From a distance, the dojo seemed smaller than she remembered. Up close, the wood smelled of liniment and salt and sunlight baking into tatami, and her throat tightened as she ran the heel of her palm along the door's splintered frame. A plaque above the entry read Sensei Kodama, estimated 1978. Her name appeared in the margins of that life like a pencil note you find tucked in a used book. Maya Ito, 1999, first kata. Miss Ito. Aiko's voice wound around her like an old melody. The woman who had taught her to fold pain into breath stood at the threshold, hair streaked with silver, and hands folded the way of someone who had meditated on patience enough to make it habitual. She looked at Maya with an expression that contained both welcome and evaluation, and Maya felt, for a moment, like she had stepped inside a chamber of memory. "It's Maya," she said. Her voice had that careful tone you use with strangers. Then she smiled, small, sheepish, because Aiko had known her since she was small enough to hide in the folded of Sensei Kodama's robes. Aiko's smile widened. "Come inside. We have things to discuss." Her eyes flicked past Maya to the dojo's interior, where mats rolled like green water and banners hung with kanji that had frayed at the edges. A rhythm of feet, the soft slap of GIS, and someone counting breath in Japanese filled the air. The Kodama dojo was more than a building. It was the counterpoint to the town's drift toward souvenir shops and chain coffee. It had been a place where children learned to fall and get up, where widowers learned to breathe again, where teenagers found the strange economy of discipline. Maya's father had taught near the back, light-footed, smiling, and she had learned to move like wind maneuvers through empty rooms. But now, Aiko said, the dojo was bleeding money. The landlord wanted to replace them with a boutique, and the town council had been leaning toward redevelopment for months. The final date, eviction or renewal, waited like a held breath. "We need the fundraiser," Aiko said. "We need attention, donations. And a fight will bring attention." Maya asked before she understood why the question felt like a small rebuke. Aiko rubbed her knuckles together. "Kenji Saito will come. He's popular with the local papers. If we can stage an exhibition, no one hurt, only demonstration, and put our faces in the paper, people come. People give. We'll manage the rules. It's a performance." "That's why you asked me." Maya had not worn a GI in 6 years. Her days as a dancer had been punctuated by rehearsals and then by a car crash, the kind that rearranged bones and timelines and left her body feeling like it had been translated into another language. For months she had learned to sit with the absence of what she could do, to teach others how to move around it. Standing in the doorway, the old hunger to move fled in her like the memory of an unfinished song. "We asked Sensei to ask you." "I did, too." Aiko's tone was soft enough to be a hand at the small of her back. "People will say we are clowning with Kenji. But if you do this," she pressed her palms together, "you can help us. Even if it's just in spirit." Maya thought of her father's laugh when he had taught her to land a perfect roll, of the ribbon scar that sat like a secret under her collarbone, of the way the sea sounded like a chorus in this town. She felt foolish and resolute at once. "I'll do it," she said, and the words felt like placing a pebble in a river. Maybe they would sink. Maybe they would ripple. Kenji arrived 2 weeks later, An easy sort of knock at the dojo's inmost room, black GI immaculate, posture billboard straight, the sort of grin that suggested the world was still his audience. He was younger than the photographs in the local paper made him out to be, the kind of young where speed had not yet been tempered into wisdom. His black belt was a ribbon of midnight looped around his waist with an almost ceremonial precision. "You must be Maya," he said, voice polished by mirrors and matchlights, extending a calloused hand. He looked her over with the interest of someone evaluating the material in front of him. "Aiko says you're up for a demonstration." "It's an exhibition," Maya said. The word was small and steady. Kenji chuckled, and it was the kind of sound that said he had already put her in a drawer in his mind and labeled her light entertainment. An exhibition. How quaint. It'll be good for the dojo's publicity. And good for me, he paused, smile widening, to show how a professional handles novices. Behind him, the reporter's arrival was an exhalation, cameras, wrist microphones, and 2 local anchors who thrived on spectacle. A reporter asked a question that smelled of catnip. "And who is your challenger, Mr. Saito?" Kenji's black eyes found Maya like a spotlight. "A gifted dancer, attempting a foray into martial arts," he said, and his words came wrapped in a polite velvet that cut. "It'll be instructive." A murmur of interest. Aiko's jaw tightened just enough for Maya to see the worry under the practice calm. The fundraiser committee shuffled schedules and sent out flyers. The town's curiosity, which had been gently simmering at the thought of an old dojo's last stand, rose into a low boil. Maya's training was not the sort of montage that builds with swelling strings. It was small increments of courage, waking before dawn to run a half hour without thinking of how her knees had once buckled, hours of grappling with gravity on the mat to relearn how to fold without fear, breathing through the phantom pain that came like waves. Aiko taught her balance and a gentler economy of motion. How to find the axis, how to let the opponent's force become the instrument. "We do not push against a tree," Aiko said, hands like a weathered page. "We redirect the wind." Ethan was the odd, bright presence in the periphery of her training. He had been her neighbor in the summers of her childhood, the boy who mended bicycles behind his father's shop. He came to the dojo sometimes to stretch with the older men and always carried a thermos of tea, which he handed to Maya with a grin that tried to be poker nice and always failed. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked one evening as twilight stitched the floorboards with long, gentle shadows. He had that clean, practical face of someone who preferred things to be straightforward. Fix the problem, mend the roof, call the supplier. Yet when he looked at her in that light, it was as if he stored 100 small kindnesses under the skin. Kenji isn't. He's not a man who enjoys being surprised. Maya tied her hair back, the ribbon a familiar weight. "I'm not trying to surprise him. I'm trying to remind myself I'm still here." Ethan's hand brushed the back of her neck, an old gesture to steady a dancer before she leaps. "Then do it for that reason. Not for him. For you." On the night of the fundraiser, the town turned out like a congregation, drawn by the story of an old dojo's last gasp and the promise of spectacle. String lights banded the dojo, and the mat sat like an island under a circle of expectant faces. People clapped and shifted and smelled fried food and saw in the center of it some small ceremonial victory over time. A reporter broadcast live from near the ropes, her voice bright and a little hungry. Kenji entered clean as a new coin, and the audience cheered with a small tribal joy of fandom. He bowed to Aiko with a mock solemnity, then turned toward Maya with a smile that could be used as a blade. "Show us, Miss Ito," he said. "Surprise us." Maya bowed, palms together, breathing like the sea. Her body felt different in public than it did in practice, tighter, as though the world had already recorded a verdict and she had to put her truth up against it. But the truth was not a single move. It was the patient accumulation of afternoons, the invisible stitches of therapy in practice, the way she had learned to accept a scar as part of a narrative rather than an end. The bell rang. At first it was a rhythm they both recognized and a language they did not. Kenji moved with the same speed that had won him adulation, the striking angles, the feints like lightning. He tested Maya with small, clinical steps, his hand falling like a guillotine of flattery into her space. The crowd leaned forward, every movement magnified. Maya felt the familiar old dance return, not simply steps but an archive of sensation. She remembered balance exercises with her father, the way he would say, "Feel the floor like breath," and she found the seam between motion and weight. Kenji pushed. She retreated like a reed does beneath a strong wind. He attacked. She accepted the momentum into her bones and let it move through her. There was a point where the audience stopped cheering and the world narrowed to Kenji's shoulder blades and a tide of arrogance riding his motion. He pulled a movement she had seen them train, a sweep to unbalance, the kind of throw designed to exploit a flinch. He expected the reflex of the frightened novice, twisting, resisting, offering the weight to the legs. Maya did not twist. She breathed in, counted the slow beat she had learned in physical therapy, and felt the line of false Kenji sent through the world. The move she chose was not decoration. It had no theatrical flourish. It was a simple redirection, the kind of technique Aiko had taught her in the silence of the morning after they had closed the windows to the cold. It required precise timing and a willingness to be present in the center of someone else's power. Kenji stepped, and his momentum was a promise he kept to himself. He would move forward and the world would rearrange itself to make him right. Maya reached, not with the flinch of resistance, but with the hand of invitation, and in that moment Kenji's momentum became her canvas. She guided the arc of him, not by strength but by listening. Her fingers found the seam at his GI, her elbow a hinge, her hips a lever position beneath the crown of his movement. For an instant it felt like suspending glass. Then, with a soft and astonishing click, Kenji's world flipped. The throw took him from upright to earth with the clean inevitability of a tide stepping back. The crowd's sound fractured into a single, collective inhalation before the mat swallowed Kenji's air. He landed with a shock that was more humiliation than pain, his face a mask of surprise as if he had been taught only the geometry of victory and not the possibility of being unmade. For a fraction of a second the dojo hovered, Kenji on his back, chest heaving, Maya standing, palms warm with the echo of force. Then, like a guillotine's release, the world fell into noise. Some of the crowd cheered with a green pleasure of surprise, others sat stunned. Reporters shouted into cameras as if sound could rearrange the fact of what had happened. Kenji's face hardened into something like fury. He snatched himself up, GI askew, jaw a set cliff. "You," he began, but his voice lacked footing. Pride, when it hits the mat, is a dangerous thing. It either bruises into humility or bursts into violence. For a moment everyone waited for violence. Maya felt it too, the thin, metallic hint of danger, and her pulse kicked. But the dojo had taught restraint. Aiko stepped forward like a lighthouse and extended a hand to Kenji, not snide but steady. "Enough," she said. The single syllable an ordinance. "We are here to show, not to harm." Kenji spat a breath like a snarl and straightened. Pride is like a loose stone on a path. If you trip on it, you either pick it up or throw it. He picked it up and walked away like a man trying to find his mask. The reporters swarmed the mat. Someone shoved a microphone into Maya's face, and she realized her jaw ached from how tight she had been holding her breath. "You did that," Ethan said at her shoulder, voice small and proud. He looked as if he had seen a small miracle, one that concerned a person he loved and not an idea. "You did that." Maya felt both elated and bereft, as if she had reached a summit to find a valley waiting on the other side. In the days after, the town wrote their curiosity into headlines that tasted faintly of scandal and triumph. "Dancer drops black belt. Local heroine." A local paper ran her picture with an angle that made her look like a winter sun, sharp and unexpected. Donations came in the form of checks folded into envelopes and a few large gifts that saved the dojo's roof and bought time with the landlord. The fundraiser had done what Aiko had intended. People talked less about the dojo's death and more about what the victory meant. But the emotional outcome was more complicated. Kenji's humiliation traveled like an open wound. He staged tournaments and gave interviews where he explained away the throw as a lucky misstep. He tried to turn the narrative into one of fluke rather than craft, because the alternative would have meant learning, and learning costs a kind of humility that not everyone can buy. Maya returned to her work in physical therapy and to teaching the dojo's toddlers how to fall. The town's attention waxed and waned, but the memory of that throw settled into people's stories like a bright stone. Sometimes, late at night, she would replay the moment not for the victory, but for the feeling of being wholly present in her body, of her breath meeting another's and finding the seam. It was the kind of thing that can change how you walk. Kenji's reaction, at first, was to sharpen into a public campaign. He took classes in other cities, posted his wins, and tried to make the loss an irrelevant note in his biography. But private setbacks are sly. They burrow. One evening the dojo's students came to Aiko with news. Kenji had sobbed in a crowded men's locker room after losing a match in another town. "He is different," one of the seniors whispered. "He is quieter." Pride is elastic. It can snap to viciousness or stretch toward understanding. Sometimes a fall is a fulcrum that will either lift you or break you. Maya did not orchestrate Kenji's path. She only offered him, unwittingly, the possibility that his armor was not necessary to defend himself. After the throw, Kenji's posture altered in small ways. He was polite enough when he saw Aiko but avoided looking at Maya. In his interviews, he was slicker, more measured. There were nights when he sat at the back of the dojo, watching younger students practice forms as if searching for the exact geometry of his undoing. It is a curious thing to watch a man who was taught to win have to learn to lose. The more she thought about the throw, the more Maya realized it was not the neat, heroic moment people imagined. It was messy with ethics. She could have tried to make Kenji's fall grander to humiliate him. She could have used that public space to exact some broader revenge for every condescension. But Aiko's lessons, folded like origami in the way she spoke, had turned her towards something else. "There's dignity in ending a fight with the least harm," Aiko said once, pressing a cup of tea across the table with hands that smelled like citrus and old liniment. "Strength without cruelty makes everyone safer." Months slid on the calendar. The dojo's roof was repaired with donated funds, the neighbors painted the frontage, and children learned to fall without fei. Maya kept teaching and returned to her dance practice in small, devotional increments. She and Ethan talked in bursts about the small future they both could imagine: night markets in town, a quiet apartment filled with plants, a shared music box. Kenji's presence in town grew less seismic. He taught classes in a different studio, still winning, but with an edge of caution in his smile. Sometimes he watched a class at Kodama through the window, no intrusion, just observation. And once, while they were stretching, he slipped in and bowed. "Sensei, Kodama taught you well," he said. It was a simple acknowledgement. His face had a faint map of humility etched into the jawline. Maya nodded once. "You're welcome here," she said. Her voice was not triumphant. It was the tone of someone closing a loop. The town's stock of stories thickened. People told the tale of Maya's throw to children the way sailors tell roots between rocks, a practical lesson wrapped in a tale. "Don't fight with a woman who moves like the tide," an older man would say with a theatrical wink. It became a way to teach that force alone does not always equate to rightness. There was a small ceremony months later when the dojo was formally registered as a community cultural center. The mayor gave a speech and people cheered, and the cameras that had once circled with a sharper interest now panned with placid respect. Kenji came to the ceremony and stood in the doorway like a man who had traveled a long distance to see a place he once thought belonged to someone else. After everyone had left, Aiko and Maya stood in the empty dojo, the tatami warm under their feet. The banners hung with new threads where the old ones had frayed. Light came through the shoji and painted the floor in gold dust. "You could have made him a lesson," Aiko said. "Not a criticism, but an observation the way one might note the weather. Some people would have used the moment to build a barricade around themselves." Maya traced a finger over the grain of the wood. "And then they wouldn't have learned anything," she said. "I didn't want to be the kind of person who takes someone down for the applause." Aiko's eyes were wet and bright with the clarity of someone who had watched many seasons change. "You gave him the chance to fall gracefully," she said. "That is a gift." Outside, the last of the evening's breeze tugged at the paper screens. In the distance, the pier lights blinked one by one like a Morse code that said, "Keep going." When Maya left the dojo that night, she walked with a steadiness that was not only the result of a winning throw, but the culmination of many small refusals to let pain define her. She had once thought that being held together by tape and good intentions was precarious. Instead, she found a sturdier architecture that came from practice and the slow remodeling of the heart. She had also learned that the most dramatic things sometimes happen in the silence between breaths, in the precise moment when you choose to listen rather than shove. Kenji's shadow passed her as he went out, and for a fraction of a second their eyes met. There was no triumph on either face, only a recognition that something had shifted. It was not a final act, but a hinge. They both carried on. On the bus heading home the next morning, Maya replayed the throw not as a sequence of steps, but as a teaching. She remembered the feeling of relinquishing the need to control everything and instead becoming an instrument of motion. It was less about defeating a person than about the exquisite possibility of being fully present with someone else's force and tending it so it did not shatter. The town changed around them with its usual slow impatience. New stores opened, others closed, and the sea kept its faithful rhythm. But inside the dojo the lesson lingered, that strength could be a soft thing, that falling did not necessarily mean ending, that grace was a muscle you could exercise until it stopped being surprising and started being ordinary. People still told the story of the day the black belt mocked her challenge and the woman dropped him with one move. They said it in bars and at kitchen tables, in PTA meetings and at the bodega where the young man sold morning newspapers. Sometimes, when they told it, they omitted the part where Maya had chosen mercy over spectacle. Sometimes they emphasized the fall like a prize. But those who knew the dojo well, Aiko, Ethan, the toddlers learning to roll, knew the truth, that the throw had been less an ending than an invitation. It was a story about listening to force, meeting it, and redirecting it, not to crush the ego but to show the human beneath it a new way to stand. Maya went on teaching and dancing in fragments and whole afternoons. She learned to take the applause and the silence with equal grace. She had found a small, clear thing, that to be challenged was not necessarily to be broken, and to respond with gentleness could contain its own terrible power. In the end, the town kept the dojo because people found it worth keeping. The landlord was paid, the roof sealed, and the walls filled with the sound of neighbors' laughter. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, if you stood at the edge of the mat and closed your eyes, you could feel that moment like a light at your sternum, the sudden, steady warmth that comes after a cold tide recedes. It was not a story of one move alone. It was a map of movement, a lineage of quiet choices that showed how dignity can be defended without brute force, and how, sometimes, a single, perfectly timed surrender is the bravest action of all.